Now let's take a little closer look at the Intel sockets that you need to be generally familiar with on this exam. Now, you probably would do yourself a favor to go out and dig around just a little bit and read up on these before you go take the exam, and then just memorize some of this basic information. Okay, so let's start off with the Intel LGA 775. You see a picture of it here. You might want to be familiar enough with these to recognize them by photograph. So just look at these a few times, and again, like I said, I'd go out and read a little bit more about them if you really want to be a nerd and do really well in the exam. Notice LGA indicates this is a land grid array. We know from our earlier sockets videos in the course that means there are pins sticking up here on the socket, and the processor will just sit down on top of these, right? Now, there's no socket holes. The socket holes are actually in the CPU itself. Now, here's the first thing you need to know about this. It has 775 pins. I'll talk about that in a second. But the LGA 775 was also known as the socket T. So just remember, socket T was the 775, and it has 775 pins that protrude up, and they touch contact points on the underside of the processor. So the 775 is the socket T. It has 775 pins. Next up is the Intel LGA 1156. Notice you would think their numbers would get higher as they get later, but they don't necessarily. They seem to be somewhat out of order, so be careful with that. This is what an 1156 looks like. Notice there's kind of a two-colored section here based on the way the light's striking this photograph. It's a little more elongated than the 775. This is known as the socket H. So just keep that in mind. The 1156 is the socket H, obviously, 1,156 pins. This was the replacement for the LGA 775. So this was the new improved socket that replaced the 775. The big functionality here is this integrates a lot of the North Bridge functionality onto the processor. Now, earlier in the course, I talked about the North Bridge and the South Bridge and how they function. Well, in an effort to make our processors even faster, some of that North Bridge functionality was moved onto the processor, which really in English means that the processor itself can communicate more directly with different aspects of the motherboard. And now the LGA 1156 is going to be discontinued sometime in 2012. Intel's already announced this, and so this thing will no longer be included in newly manufactured machines, but you'll still see it out there for a number of years now because it was popular and it's been out there. And the LGA 1366 is also going to be discontinued, but don't let me confuse you here. We'll get to that one in just a second. Now, the Intel LGA 1155 is only one pin different from the 56, but they're not compatible. All right, so make sure that you notice the look of that one. This is called a socket H2, has 1155 pins. This is the replacement for the socket H 1156. So the higher number was the first one, 1156 was the original, it was the socket H. The 1155 replaces it, and it's the socket H2, and it has one less pin. Now, the big piece of functionality here that the socket H2 is known for is it supports the Sandy Bridge and the Ivy Bridge microprocessor functionality on this particular CPU, and the Sandy Bridge functionalities of the CPU that fits into the socket will support up to DDR3 1333 RAM memory, and that's pretty fast. And then the Ivy Bridge version of the microprocessor that will fit this socket will support up to DDR3 1600 memory. Okay, so this is kind of the new shiny deal here. All right. And then the last one, the Intel LGA 1366. Notice how that one looks. This is the socket B. This one was also known as socket B. Big surprise here, it has 1,366 pins. It was introduced in 2008. Again, Intel's doing some house cleaning on their sockets. This socket will be discontinued in 2012, but you will still see them out there because there's been quite a few of them. So that's the Intel sockets you need to be aware of. Now, I've given you the base information, but again, you might want to go out there to Intel's site and just read about these a little bit and see what sticks in your brain. You will see these particular models mentioned. Just make sure you read up and remember what I've told you here are the major aspects or features of these sockets, and you should be good to go. So that's a quick overview of the Intel sockets that you may see on the exam.